Ladies and gentlemen, the panel this evening comprises Dr. Jayampathi Vikramaratne, President's Counsel, Dr. Kumara Vadivel Guruparan, Attorney at Law, Mr. Udaya Gamampila, former Member of Parliament and Attorney at Law, Honorable Nizam Khariappar, President's Counsel and Member of Parliament. We also have with us, joining us this evening, Dr. Ramesh Ramasamy. Ladies and gentlemen, moderating this discussion this evening is Dr. Kalana Senaratne.
I want to firstly begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me to moderate this discussion at a time when a new and important effort at constitution making is being made by the One Text initiative. I'm indeed honored to be moderating this panel discussion, which I think consists of very eminent persons, including colleagues with whom I've worked at different capacities before. I also need to say this, and I think I've told Faiz about this. I think I need to make a comment, which is that the honor would have been greater had there been women representation on this panel, because we're talking about the majority of the Sri Lankan population. And yes, I think the process includes subcommittees which are chaired by well-known women's rights activists. Yes, Professor Udagamba delivered the keynote speech, but I think these cannot be excuses in a day, in an age of this nature, when we are talking about important matters like constitutional reform. Having said that, let me set out the basic format of this panel discussion. Firstly, I think I'll invite each of the panelists to make their opening remarks for about 8 minutes, and I think brevity is going to be the key skill here. Thereafter, there will be a round of questions directed at each of the panelists, where they will be able to perhaps elaborate on some of the issues that they talk about in their opening remarks. We will take a couple of questions from the audience, perhaps, if there is time. I sort of hesitate to open up the discussion to an audience of this nature on constitutional reform, but let's see. I think the organizers have said that maybe a couple of questions can be taken if there is time. And then final remarks by each of the panelists, final comments on what needs to be highlighted going forward, and then conclude the discussion knowing fully well that some of the more interesting points about constitutional reform are discussed generally over cocktails. I will now proceed to invite the panelists to make their opening remarks. Firstly, I'll go with Dr. Jayampathi Vikramaratne. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, One Text, for this opportunity. Distinguished invitees, ladies and gentlemen, a few words about the process. The NPP in its manifesto, election manifesto, has committed itself to a continuation of the 2016-18 process that some of us participated. So I think that's a good, good starting point, because our experience, of course, because of the differences between the then President and the Prime Minister, the process broke down in 2018, also after the dissolution of Parliament, the legal dissolution of Parliament. But the process, I thought, was good, because the entire Parliament would, all 225 members would constitute a parliamentary committee, Committee of Parliament, the Constitutional Assembly, as we called it, to see whether a two-thirds a draft which can muster a two-thirds majority can be agreed upon. And then, of course, it cannot adopt a constitution. It has to come back to Parliament proper to adopt the constitution. The steering committee there was an all-party steering committee. A lot of work was done. I think we met about 100 times, nearly 100 times. There were on many issues there was agreement. Of course, there were diverging views, as one would expect. There were 6 subcommittees, and the reports were almost all were unanimous. There were, of course, few dissenting remarks, but basically the 6 subcommittees submitted unanimous reports on fundamental rights and language rights, on finance, on the public service, on law and order and national security, on relations between the periphery and the state and the center and the periphery, and one more which I forget. I think the process, therefore, the continuation of the process is a very good idea. Regarding the Public Representations Committee, the Public Representations Committee was not appointed by the steering committee or the Constitutional Assembly. It was appointed in advance of the process. And although the report is very good, I remember whenever the report was discussed in the steering committee, the JVP would remind the committee that it was not a committee appointed by the Constitutional Assembly, but by the government. So if we have to have a public representation committee or some process like that, it is important that all parties, all stakeholders are involved. Regarding possible constitution, what kind of constitution do we want? I think we should go in for a constitution with a futuristic vision. Not merely a new constitution, but one with a futuristic vision. I've been always asked, what kind of model are you looking at? I have always said, no model to look at, but we will learn from other constitutions, especially of developing countries. Recent constitutions, not so recent some, South Africa, which gave us the lead, Nepal, Kenya, East Timor, which is still a least developing country, which have come out with some very good constitutional provisions. Do we want the constitution to be supreme? Professor Udagama raised this issue, and I think that is a must. Today we have 1972 constitution and the 72 constitution, both talk about the supremacy of the constitution, but the constitution is not supreme. Parliamentary laws cannot be reviewed by the Supreme Court. We cannot even review a British given law. Our courts cannot even review a British given law, whereas India has gone ahead. Recently, a few years back, very important decisions were handed out by the Indian Supreme Court. For example, because I say this because there is a new film on triple talaq, which is on Netflix now. Is Bano, right? Which is, I would recommend that you watch it. Right? Sairo Bano case on the triple talaq. So I think post-enactment judicial review, Dr. Udagama flagged this issue is very important. And we cannot, for example, still women cannot vote at the elections, at the election of the Dievad and Nilume. So what equality? And our courts cannot do anything about it. And going back to Parliament, I am for going back to Parliament, but not for parliamentary supremacy. It's the Constitution that should be supreme. There must be post-enactment judicial review, and decisions of the Speaker and the various committees, they cannot be challenged. There are some controversial decisions recently which are plainly unconstitutional, but there is no remedy. There is no remedy. In other countries, the trend is, for example, Malawi, I've written about this, Malawi, India, South Africa, and Papua New Guinea, where I had the occasion to work recently. A 50-year-old constitution, still a least developing country, where the Supreme Court can declare acts of parliament other than legislation unconstitutional. I'll give an example. The Governor General is nominated by Parliament, elected by Parliament, formally appointed by the King or Queen in London. Some time back, the election of the Governor General in Parliament was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. And they said, no, you have not followed the Constitution. Have the election again. Even fixed a date no protest whatsoever. And there is, and many such decisions of committees of the Speaker, etc., of Parliament are reviewed by the Supreme Court, and there is no demand for change. That is well accepted by the country, and I think therefore we should look at such issues as well. We have generally accepted without protest this issue of parliamentary supremacy. The freedom to debate is different. Of course, members of parliament should have the freedom to debate without having consequences, but unconstitutional decisions of parliament must be made reviewable by the judiciary. Should we have a basic structure? India does not have a constitution, does not talk about a basic structure of the constitution. The Supreme Court had developed the doctrine of basic structure. Should we allow a future Supreme Court to decide whether there is a unalterable basic structure? Wouldn't it be safer, better for the constitution itself to say that this is the basic structure which cannot be changed at all? For example, should a two-thirds majority and two-thirds majority in parliament and a majority of people, 50% plus one of the people, should they be allowed to make any constitutional change? One-party state, the two-thirds majority for 50%, one say, no, Sri Lanka will be a one-party state. No freedom from torture for those accused of terrorist offences or ICCPR offences. It can happen. It can happen. Now, fortunately, both under Mr. Gotabaya Rajapaksa and the NPP, I mean, they could have followed their victory immediately with any constitutional change. But fortunately, that did not happen. But we don't know about the future. So I would suggest that we look at having a basic structure. Well, if you go to the Constitution, look at the preamble, you find certain elements, also although not described as a basic structure, the immutable principles, the phrase uses immutable principles. Anulanganiya, ulanganiya nokala haki in Sinhala. Republicanism, representative democracy. Do we also want to add deliberative democracy in light of what happened in 2022? Should the people also get involved? Shouldn't the people also be involved in the legislative process? Again, going back to PNG, Papua New Guinea, the constitution mandates a consultative process in all the provinces. The constitution also mentions freedom, justice, human rights, independence of the judiciary. So they can all be part of an unalterable basic structure. That is my suggestion. What about principles and goals of the constitution? My own view is that we should go back to parliamentary democracy and freeing it from the control of the president and the executive while establishing the supremacy of the constitution, not the supremacy of parliament. Restoring public trust and faith in the constitution, parliament and institutions of government and democracy. Ensuring the people's right to hold government and elected representatives accountable through new mechanisms. The aim is to make the principle of popular sovereignty meaningful to the people who are the bearers of sovereignty in a democracy. Preventing the government from using political power. When I mean government, I mean not only the executive but also parliament. Using political power to misuse the constitution and the law for arbitrary and tyrannical objectives. Deepening democracy through citizens' participation in the process of government. A couple of years back, a group of lawyers and political scientists, legal academics, Professor Uyangoda coordinated this group. There are a few members of the group are here in this hall. We proposed that a set of constitutional principles be included in the constitution, described as immutable and inviolable values of democratic republicanism, which will embody fundamental constitutional values that will guide a new constitution, as well as future judicial interpretation of the constitution. I think that is important. We came out with a set of principles which I would present to you. This can be discussed further. Sri Lanka to be one free, sovereign, and democratic and independent republic, founded on the following immutable and inviolable values of democratic republicanism: human dignity, social justice, economic justice, equality, and the advancement of human rights and freedoms; ethnic, gender, and social equality; the supremacy of the constitution and the rule of law; regular, uninterrupted, free and fair elections, and a multi-party system of democratic government; non-concentration of state power in one individual or institution; the assurance of accountability, responsiveness, and transparency at all levels of government. Finally, public authorities hold and exercise powers in accordance with the doctrine of public trust. So we need to innovate, not just a new constitution, a forward-looking constitution, one with a futuristic vision. We learn from the world, not follow any models, but learn from the world. Also, especially learn from modern constitution, recent constitutions, some of which I've named from the developing countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir, for that very clinical sort of setting out of key issues. Next, I would prefer to sort of break the predictability also of this discussion and maybe ask Mr. Begum, would you like to go next? Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to start from a remark made by Dr. Deepika Udugama in her keynote address. She mentioned that she was first involved in constitutional reforms as a law student, and now she's a retired academic but still talk about constitutional reforms. Actually, it has some kind of a reflection on me, because I have been also involved in this debate nearly 30 years now. I can well remember we used to debate with Mr. Sambandhan, Professor Jayadeva Uyangoda. I found Mr. Pakeswati Sarwanamuthu here, Dr. Rohan Edirisinghe, so Mr. Raufa came. So we have been debating for a while, despite our strong friendship as schoolmates. So last 30 years, we have been debating on constitutional reforms. And as a result, we are fully aware of Sinhala, Tamil, Muslim perspectives of constitutional reform. Not only we are well debated, we are well documented as well. Then we have to think, before commencing this kind of initiative, I think as a nation, we have a responsibility to find out why all these previous attempts failed. Professor G.L. Pires was the Minister of Constitutional Affairs for a long time. So all stakeholders are here. We have failed in reaching consensus. Without finding why, all these attempts would be futile. This is not a bad omen, but I have to warn OTI that without finding the reason, we can't move forward. So, in this constitutional debate, I found three main issues. These are the three main issues where our society is polarized or sharply divided. Let me, firstly, the nature of the state. As we know, in simple terms, whether Sri Lanka should be a unitary state or a federal state. In this context, we found most of the minorities are in favor of a federal state. On the other hand, majority community is in favor of the unitary state. So that's something, and this division has been in our society now nearly for 100 years. If you go through the submissions made by different groups before Donomer Commission, we find our division there as well. If we look at the submissions before the Salisbury Commission, of course, this community division is strongly reflected in those submissions. So unless we can find our challenge, the challenge before us is how to find the middle ground to reach consensus. Our first issue is unitary federal debate. And in this context, I must recall, there are hundreds of research papers prepared by NGOs and universities about why Tamils compelled to become suicide bombers, why Tamil compelled to wage a brutal war. On the other hand, Sinhalese have been resisting federalism for more than 80 years now, or nearly 80 years. Unfortunately, there are no adequate research on why Sinhalese have been resisting federalism for such a long time. Unless there is a strong conviction, such a resistant movement cannot last this long. That's a simple truth. Therefore, I think it is very much important for academia to address this issue. Understand the Sinhala mindset. What is the rationale behind the Sinhala thinking? Without understanding this mindset, we would not be able to reach the middle ground as we envisage here. Our second issue, system of governance. In simple terms, whether presidential system or parliamentary system, you may call it Westminster system. Dr. Udugama openly declared that she is against presidential system. I belong to the minority who are in support of the presidential system. Of course, I must admit that our society is not that much polarized on this issue. If you look at the unitary federal debate, our society is sharply divided. But here, I must admit that I belong to the very insignificant minority, but we have been explaining our view of why we believe that a presidential system must be protected. We think it's a modern and more popular system, and unfortunately, Sri Lankans think when we say the presidential system, we look at the presidential system through the 1978 Constitution. Although we are in support of presidential system, we strongly believe our presidential system must be reformed to make president subject to judicial review and accountable to parliament. Then the third issue, independence of the bureaucracy. Of course, when you say that not on the state machinery, nobody would argue about the independence of judiciary, then Auditor General, Election Commission, and other such institutes. But independence of the bureaucracy is a subject of debate. As we could recall, in 1978, before that, I must mention that in USA, there is a doctrine that believers of president's policy shall command the government machinery. That's why there are more than 4,000 appointments made by a US president during his term. Because they believe if the commanders of the governmental machinery is not the people who believe in president's policies, this machinery cannot be moved properly. In the end, president must be able to implement his election manifesto without the support of the bureaucracy. That cannot be done. Then, in Sri Lanka, we can remember under Salisbury Constitution, our bureaucracy enjoyed a very high degree of independence, but by introducing the first Republican Constitution in 1972, it was abolished to a great extent, or reduced to a great extent. Participating in the Constitutional Assembly debate, Dr. Colvin R. De Silva justified the abolition of the independence of the bureaucracy uh, emphasizing the sovereignty of the people. There's a very interesting points made by him during that debate. So thereafter, as I explained, politicians would love to exercise some degree of control over the bureaucratic or governmental machinery to ensure that their mandate is implemented during their term in power. Then, we know, of course, but there was a strong debate about the independence of the bureaucracy. As a result, 17th Amendment to the Constitution to the 21st Amendment to the Constitution was brought to change the degree of independence of the bureaucracy. So this is another issue where our society is sharply divided. There are other issues, as mentioned by Professor Udugama, Dr. Jayampathy Vikramaratne. We have to expand our personal rights, improve our good governance. There are a lot of areas that we must expand our constitution and introduce new features to our constitution. But in those areas, there is no much division. As a result, there will be no much resistance. If we want to introduce a new constitution, we have been discussing a lot of drafts. The later, actually, we have been members of the All-Party Representative Committee for 3 years, from 2006 to 2009. We were working around the clock to produce a constitution. Our chairperson was Professor Tiswitan, he's present here. Then Dr. Jayampathy Vikramaratne was in the center stage of Constitutional Assembly form in 2016. I served the Center Peripheral Relations Subcommittee. The latest attempt was from President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, as mentioned by Dr. Udugama. There was a committee appointed by President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, of which Dr. Romesh Silva PC was the chairperson. They have produced a very good document with regard to personal rights and good governance. So there are a lot of documents. But there is no point of producing another document which is not accepted by the entire nation as a whole. So without solving these three challenges, you may not be able to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. You raised three key challenges, and I think Harindra in his presentation referred to the need to come up with a consensus document. And I think partly the answer to that is there in what Mr. Gamampila referred to, the sheer difficulty of arriving at a consensus is right here. Next, I'll invite Dr. Guruparan to make his opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Kalana, for moderating this session, and thank you to OneTex Initiatives and Nexus Research for inviting me to be part of this panel. The first question that I want to address, there are three that I want to address if I get to my third, and Kalana will indicate to me if I am taking too much of time. The first question that I want to ask is as to whether there is a democratic fervor for constitutional reform, really speaking. And if so, what the contents of the democratic desire for constitutional reform is. And it seems to me that post-Aragalaya, everyone wants to catch on the buzzword of deliberative democracy, inclusive participation, and relegate to a secondary position the national question which has animated the constitutional reform debate for the last 40, 50 years. Which leads then to the question as to whether there is, from a liberal democratic point of view, a demand for constitutional reform that addresses the national question. Post-2009, we've heard again voices asking the question after the demise of the LTTE as to whether this is relevant even. The questions that are posed are whether Tamil should not join, quote unquote, the mainstream, engage in the larger debates of governance, and hence that the debate over the national question is relevant. But Tamils, in terms of their voting pattern, including the last parliamentary elections, I dare say, have indicated that a resolution to the national question is a priority for them. The question is it a priority for the country as a whole? And I'll come to this process question in a minute. Or is it really that it's still part of the agenda because dealing with the ethnic question, with the national question and resolution of such, is it only a foreign policy management issue for the state and its government? It seems to me that both accountability for crimes that were committed during the war and also finding a political solution are really a foreign policy management issue for governments that have successfully come in since 2009 and not really something that they have taken to heart. Now that's an issue that needs to be confronted. The leadership of the state, of the government of the day, must understand and articulate that resolving the national question part of the constitutional reform debate is important, and if not, then you're going to leave the numerically smaller communities out. That's the first point that I want to make. The second is with regard to process. Now here is a challenge. You have within, if you take a liberal democratic understanding of the state, you fall on majoritarian democracy. Now, can a majoritarian process of decision making deliver a non-majoritarian democratic state? Would the majority, in terms of numerical majority, and here because we are a deeply divided country, that is, at least on the national question, the fault lines are very clear, why would they agree to, as to Mr. Gamanpilla says, a constitution that is non-unitary in nature? Right? And how do we devise in a process that is non-majoritarian? Take the Constitutional Assembly, for example. Clearly, 2/3 members are going to be drawn from the singular Buddhist nationalist parties. If you'll pardon me for classifying them as such. If so, what is the democratic desire that they will have to produce a non-majoritarian democratic state? So Dr. Jayapathy Vikramaratne, for whom I have the utmost respect and from whom I learned a lot about constitutional law, speaks of inviolable principles that they've developed, but one of them is not, for example, a secular state. Is it because this majoritarian process of new constitution making cannot deliver a non-majoritarian state, which would then have to be secular? Right? So the question then is, the key question then in the design process, and my request to One Text Initiative is, before you get to the substance, think of the process. Think of what happened in South Africa. Professor Udagama referred to South Africa. Prior to sitting down and talking about the substantial content of the constitution, they had what is called the Conference on a Democratic South Africa, where the different parties who were involved in the question of re-encapsulating what a democratic South Africa needs to look like, sat down and came up with basic principles of the South African constitution, which they called the interim constitution. And then from there developed a new constitution, which the Constitutional Court was asked to look at as to whether it meets those principles. Now I think that prior to us getting into the nitty-gritties of, how do you design the executive, how do you design the legislature, we need to agree as to what the state is about. Do we agree that it's plural? Do we agree that it's plurinational, which is different? It's not just plural in the sense of accommodating the different identities, but plurinational in terms of recognizing the different constituent nations and constituent communities of Sri Lanka. Are we agreed that this is a secular state? Are we agreed that when it comes to centralization, it's not just the executive presidency that is a problem, but also the unitary character of the state? These are the ideals, vision of a constitution that there must be broad agreement upon before we can embark on the journey of starting to talk about the contents of a constitution. So any constitutional process then will have to deal with how do you design a process through which we can agree that a non-majoritarian constitution can be delivered. If we agree that a non-majoritarian constitution is what we are trying to aim at, right? Which would then cannot be just about, look at, one of my major criticisms of the PRC, the Public Representation Committee, was they went around the country They heard very diverse representation. What they heard in Hambantota was not what they heard in Jaffna. What they heard in Ambara was not what they heard in Badulla. How did they come up with that singular report and say that this is how we distilled it? What was that mechanism? How did you distill all these very divergent and deeply divided opinions of what a constitution should look like into a report? And I don't think there was a lot of time spent on it. So you had representations, you took in views, but then you came up with your own report where there was, and I'm still at a loss in terms of what methodological approach one can even come up with, because I don't know what sort of a methodological approach you can come with. You say, I go and talk to everyone and I come up with a report, but I don't know how you do it. And this is the problem that I'm talking to. This is the process problem that I'm talking to. So at the end of the day, if you don't want this to be an expert-driven sort of, process of delivering a constitution where some ideal people, quote-unquote ideal people, elite, driven people who have an understanding of what a constitution should look like are engaged in a process, then we need to be very careful about what this process, how this process design is going to look like. So that is both at the stage of public consultation, but also when you're talking about a constitutional assembly. I want to move now to, and Kalana saying 1 minute probably, yes, the unitary federal label. Much has been said. You look at the 2019 process. I don't think you can engage in a constitutional reform process where you're coming out of a deeply divided state, where there is no clear communication in terms of where you're going. When I read the interim report and we had a discussion in Jaffna in a public meeting, I said, you have a type of a juice, you've made a juice, and you try to sell it as pineapple juice to the Sinhalese, and you try to sell it as orange juice to the Tamils. You cannot have that. And that is what I characterize the whole Ekya Rajya and Orumithanadu debate to be. There needs to be clarity. And if this country has been unitary in nature, and if you agree with me that the unitary culture has steeped into our institutions, and if this country is serious about taking a turn away from that, that signaling has to be very clear. You cannot be wishy-washy about that. And that's why I think while there are people who will argue that labels are not important, I would say labels are important if you are signaling, if you are telling the country that we are taking, we are changing here. We are putting our signal and turning to the right here, turning to the left here. That needs to be very clear. You can't be wishy-washy about that, and that's very important to me. And finally, about leadership. In 2009, we said this about President Rajapaksa. In 2015, we said this about President Sri Sena. And now in 2025, we are saying this about President Anukumara Dissanayaka. That they have come with so much of support and a big mandate, and that they have the right opportunity to convince the majority of this country that these changes are essential. The question is, pre-2009, the excuse was the LTTE. Post-2009, there is no LTTE. What is the excuse for not clearly communicating as to what this country should be, particularly the pluralist turn it needs to take? And there I think, you look at, I was, for example, the recent appointments, and I'm sorry if this is controversial, but you look at the recent appointments, what is in common parlance called the civil society nomination to the Constitutional Council. The Constitutional Council current provisions provide that the nominee of the Prime Minister, the nominee of the opposition leader, and the three quote-unquote civil society representatives, or people who have done distinguished service in various walks of life, need to represent the pluralist character of the country. Can we look at the three nominees who were appointed to the Constitutional Council and say that it reflects that? It doesn't. So that then leads to the final question, which is whether we have a constitutional culture in this country. And why is that important? Time and again, Tamils have been told that there can be a negotiated solution. That negotiated solution can come through a constitution. But then the big question is, you can have a very good constitution, even a federal constitution, that is not implemented. Would that be solved by putting in a supremacy clause? It won't be solved by putting in a supremacy clause alone. That would mean that we develop a culture of constitutionalism where the constitution can be an arbitrator of the disputes that we have. The question is, whether we are having conversations in our communities towards that objective, and it doesn't seem like that to me. And so, and sorry if that's a very negative note to finish this out on, but I think these are the hard questions that we have to ask, that we cannot avoid as we look forward to one more round of constitutional reform debates in this country. Thank you very much.
Guru, thank you very much for those very provocative, fundamental questions that you've raised. I think we'll need to revisit them maybe in our questions. Now I'll invite Mr. Karyappa for his opening remarks.
Thank you. Now, good afternoon, distinguished panelists and audience members, many of whom I recognize as former and current parliamentarians and of course former ministers. It's a privilege to be part of this panel. I thank the organization for this opportunity. Now, I wish to reflect a little bit of the importance of citizen participation in constitutional making of Sri Lanka with this historical trajectory that we have seen in the past. Now, 1931 Donamo Constitution, there was this semblance of consultation with the people. This in 1927 to 1931, often cited as the first attempt to citizen consultation. Island-wide hearing with villages, trade unions, and religious bodies took place. Acceptance of written submissions from ordinary citizens. And the outcome, we got the universal adult franchise, sovereignty explicitly vested with the people. Now, while Donamo Constitution is lauded for citizens' input, it was politically motivated by those in power, projecting the appearance of participation while controlling the process. This shows a key lesson. Consultation without genuine empowerment risks manipulations. Now, what happens the post-Donamo era? Salisbury Constitution, drafted primarily by political elites and colonial authorities, even the semblance of consultation is lost. Citizens had no meaningful role. 1972 Constitution, dominated by ruling party elites, opposition largely excluded, public participation is minimal. 1978 Constitution, drafted by small elite group, some people say by one person, created a strong executive presidency, citizens' voice largely ignored, minority was completely not even acknowledged. Now, after 1931, we see the shifted decisively from the citizen-centered design to elite-driven top-down lawmaking, where the constitution had become an instrument owned by the political elite rather than the people. That's the fundamental issue. Now, constitutional reform published, but never adopted. So many constitutional reforms. Several reforms or initiatives reached the public domain or parliamentary discussion, but never became a law. Now, 1995 to 2000 constitutional reform drafts, I think when my late leader, Mr. Ashraf, was one who actually read the entire constitution, new constitution reform, 2000 bill, but nothing became the law. Draft published for public comments, thousands of submissions received, outcome, absence of political will prevented its adoption. Reports now sits in the parliamentary archives. Now, 2015 to 2019 constitutional reform proposals, draft entered public consultations, citizens' input was significant, outcome, despite widespread participation, no law emerged. Committee reports remain largely unread in parliament library. Now, numerous proposals and reports document public input but were shelved. Sri Lankan's constitution has never been fully owned by the people. Citizens' voices have been recorded, yet repeatedly ignored or blocked from becoming law. This historical pattern undermines the legitimacy and fuel public alienations. People do not own the constitution that we have. The failure to genuinely incorporate public input has profound consequences. Marginalization of ethnic minority and unprecedented groups. Policies favoring elites and majority interest. Erosion of trust in institution. Exclusion of contributed to grievances of that fueled ethnic conflict. Isn't that the truth? including this, which ended up in a civil war. When the citizens are denied ownership of the constitution, it ceases to be a social contract, which we now speaks in all these academic review, academic discussion, becomes a tools of political convenience. That's the truth. Every single amendment to the constitution is completely political motivated to suit the need of the politicians who are in power. Now, citizen-centered constitution, our dream. Now, they say sovereignty belongs to the people, but only in theory. Isn't that so? Because equal participation prevents alienation and conflict. Transparency, inclusiveness are essential for legitimacy. Without genuine and citizen ownership, constitutional reform risks repeating the mistakes of the past. Now, let's talk about the digital platform. How are we going to use that at least for the new constitutional reform? A new frontier for citizen-driven reform is something that is very appropriate for this century. Online consultation portals, citizens can submit proposals and feedback in real time, reduces geographical and social barriers to participation. Then the social media engagement and raises awareness and enables structural discussions, gives marginalized voice visibility, collaborative drafting platform. Now, that's another crowdsourcing constitutional text for discussions and refinement. Track consensus and flag contested provisions. Though we have been fighting at the top level of the politicians, maybe suddenly we can see the ordinary people, be that is Muhammad or Kandasamy or whoever, even a Sinhala, there can be a consensus that is reached in the digital platform. Now, this all speaks about the transparency and the accountability. Now, I will say public dashboards can be display submissions, status, and the government response. This reduces the risk of elite capture. Now, Sri Lankan constitutional history demonstrates a stark truth. Citizen participation is not just a democratic, it's a peace building, exclusion of breed alienation, inclusion of builds cohesion. Our constitution has historically been owned by political elites. Let's accept it, not the people. In fact, if not at all, but majority are politically motivated to suit those who are in power. The true reform requires placing citizens at the center, using technology to broaden the participation, and ensuring transparency, equality, and accountability. And just I'll quickly conclude. There's something about the present contemporary position. The present government has unequivocally promised the abolition of the presidential system. Yet, we now hear that the President Andrakumar Disanayak will be the last president, which conveniently leaves room for one more term. After winning back power, as he is expecting to do, he may simply declare, I have exhausted all my chances, so let's abolish the system. Nothing new, isn't it? We have heard this with every past president saying the same thing. It reminds us the famous children's poem, There's a Hole in the Bucket. I just realizing in this poem, each proposed solution leads to another problem, creating a circular, seemingly endless cycle. One person's identify a problem, another proposes a solution, which in turn requires further actions. And we have been doing it, APRC, leading back to an additional problem. The dialogue continues without a final resolution, highlighting the challenges, interdependence on solution. Similarly, the constitutional reform debate, each reform proposal often triggers new legal, political, and procedural questions. Stakeholder response with counter reforms are prerequisites, creating a loop of conditional solution. So I will say progress is slowed and a perfect resolution remains elusive unless the circular logic is broken with a consensus or a simplified approach. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nizam. Since we are running out of time, I'll quickly invite Dr. Ramesh for his.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me first thank the One Text Initiative and the Nexus Research Group for inviting me to be a part of this panel discussion, and thank you, Kalana, for moderating this. So actually, many has been said already. We need a new constitution, there is no doubt on that. And we have been discussing this for many, many years in Sri Lanka about a new constitution. And the new constitution depends on two factors, according to my understanding. One is the political will or the commitment, and the context through which we are making the constitution. So in the case of Sri Lanka, in 2022, very clearly we witnessed the social contract is expired in Sri Lanka. So we need to renew the social contract with popular participation. That is very important in a new constitution making process. So we all know that in Bangladesh, there is an interim government in Bangladesh, and they are struggling with political reforms because the entire reform process in Bangladesh is elite driven and technocratic. There is no political, there is no space for public participation. So in our case, we should actually encourage citizen participation in the constitutional making process. And I would like to raise two fundamental questions when we talk about constitutional reforms in Sri Lanka. One is, as Gurubaran stated, so we are ready to reform the constitution. We need a new constitution, there is no doubt. So are we ready to reform the ethnocratic nature of the Sri Lankan state? This is my first question. Right? So Sri Lankan state has been ethnocratic, and it has produced ethnocratic governance, not inclusive governance or inclusive democracy. It has very effectively, actively excluded minorities from the governance process. So therefore, I think any discussion on constitutional reform in Sri Lanka must begin with how to reform the Sri Lankan state. So this is also partly linked with post-colonial state building in Sri Lanka. The post-colonial state building in Sri Lanka is largely based on the majoritarian idea, which has been manifested through a number of laws, policies, practices, and security-driven governance in this country. So therefore, I think we need to fundamentally think and discuss and debate about how to reform the ethnocratic nature of Sri Lanka. So that is why, as Professor Udagama mentioned, we need to democratize the state first, Sri Lankan state. Where with the popular participation, all communities should participate in the constitution making process, which would enable the state to be more inclusive, liberal, secular. We can say whatever we want. So that is number one. And the second point is that due to civil war, the Sri Lankan state has become national security state, right? Due to different laws introduced by the successive governments of this country. Even now we are struggling with a new proposed law, which again is going to protect the state in the name of terrorism. So how are we going to reform the Sri Lankan state, the national security state of Sri Lanka? This is another question we need to address when we talk about constitutional reform in Sri Lanka. And two other points I would like to make with regard to minorities' concerns in Sri Lanka. What minorities are anticipating with regard to constitutional reforms? They basically expect explicit constitutional recognition. Their rights, identity, culture should be explicitly guaranteed in the constitution. There should not be any room for discrimination against minorities. So that is where we can draw lessons from Nepal and Kenya, where they have very clearly, constitutionally guaranteed minority rights, inclusion, gender equality, and very comprehensive fundamental rights chapter, secular state, strong bill of rights, devolution of power, and so on. And also strong checks and balances on executive. So in these two countries, people say Nepal's constitution as the most inclusive constitution in South Asia. And people say Kenyan constitution as the most transformative constitution in Africa, because they have shifted the power from rulers to citizens. That is the whole idea of constitutional making in these countries, very progressive. So we can also learn lessons from these countries when we talk and debate about constitutional making. And the last point is that, in the interest of time, I would like to be brief. So we are also very much scared about and skeptical about power sharing in Sri Lanka, as Madam mentioned. And we are also very much worried about territorial separation due to various reasons. There can be several justifications for that. But there are also innovative models across the world which we can adopt with regard to power sharing in Sri Lanka. I would like to highlight one point here that is very much relevant to Malayaga Tamils and Muslims in this country who are dispersed across Sri Lanka. In countries like Hungary, Serbia, and Slovenia, and Estonia, among many other countries, they have introduced non-territorial power sharing to include dispersed minority in the governance process. They have set up different constitutional mechanisms: Minority Governance Council, National Minority Council, Minority Council. They are using different names for this. And these councils are very much powerful, and they directly funded by the central government, and they have legal status, and they deal with language, culture, and education of minorities. So why don't we think about such institutional mechanism to ensure rights of dispersed minorities in this country? So with that, I stop, and we can have a Q&A. We can discuss more during the Q&A session. Thank you.
Ramesh, thank you very much. I think you raised a very important point when you refer to the non-territorial means of power sharing, which is not popularly discussed sometimes in our discussions. I think we are running out of time, but maybe just raise two questions, broad questions that are directed firstly at some of the panelists here, but I think it's open to all of you to sort of respond to. One is the moderate position that I think Mr. Gammampila referred to in your opening remarks. Because I think, you have been a very vocal advocate of Sinhala Buddhist nationalist political aspirations. And one of the questions that arose initially is, has the Sinhala youth in particular, especially we're talking about the post-Aragalaya generation, era and so on, has the youth sort of moved away from the kind of project that you've been advocating for a long time? And have we reached a stage where perhaps a more moderate position can be adopted? And I think that also can be contested. Why are you asking a more moderate position? Why, is it because we are extremists? I mean, that's perhaps a response that you have. But we talk about devolution, for example. Now, my understanding is that the Sinhala Buddhist nationalist position is that why devolve in the first place? Why to the provincial level? Whereas the Tamil nationalist perspective would say it should be the provincial level, the larger unit. But there are also very interesting suggestions that have been made about how a moderated approach can be adopted to something like devolution. I think Professor G.L. Piris is here. His book refers to Minister Chitambaram talking about police powers. How you can be very innovative about police powers, have a gradual system where minor offences or minor sort of offences are being given to the provincial police forces and so on. So there are various options, but have we reached that stage where these can be discussed, or are we going back to the highly sort of inflammatory kind of rhetoric where we either reject devolution or say yes to it?
Well, actually, your first question was that whether Sinhala youth has shifted away from Sinhala nationalism. If you take the period from so I'm sorry. Without your warning, it would have been a personal conversation. Thank you. Frankly, from 2022 to 2025, this period of 3 years, it was a kind of a snapshot. Our people in general, youth in particular, shifted away from their traditional thinking, and they expressed their anger against the existing system. That's how I read it. And they have now expressed their anger, so they are now settling down. So in that sense, and their experiment. Now, frankly, I didn't want to discuss about party politics here, but they have now realized their experiment at the last elections, inclusive of Aragalaya, as a failure because of the failures of the present government. Therefore, their change, frankly, there was a change in their thinking, their attitudes, the way they look at the world, their perspectives. So that change would have been bonded there if government was a success. Because of the present government's failure, they are slowly but surely coming back to where they were. That's why traditional political parties are gaining grounds at grassroots levels. So the period between 2022 to 2025, we have classified as the shifting away from the traditional thinking, but my reading is different. I feel it was something temporary. It was an expression of anger and frustration, and they have done it. So now they are coming back to where they were. What was your second question? If there is any.
I think so that, yeah, it's about moderate approach to, let's say, power sharing, for example. I don't know
Well,
whether we have the time.
you asked about the unit. You said Tamils are in favor of the province. So you said there are different, when you say the singular nationalism, you can't define in a clear cut, you can't mark the boundaries. So there are some nationalists who would say no, there, as you just mentioned, there is no logic behind demand for power devolution. There must be no power devolution. Some people, there can be power devolution, but not at the provincial level, but at the district level. But so there are different views. In my view, we are in agreement. Actually, I have debated with the previous generation, from Mr. Sambandhan to, throughout my political career, I maintain the position that we are ready to accommodate the degree of devolution at provincial level. So it doesn't mean that this is the absolute sole representation of the singular view, but I believe I belong to the majority in this case.
Thank you very much, sir. So I've been asked to sort of conclude the session by 6:40.
He says, if you say okay, the rest would say okay.
Okay.
From the Sinhala
Exactly.
point of view.
By 6:45. So I think I just pose one question and conclude this session. This is about the process. I think Professor Udagama has referred to it. All the speakers have referred to it. Most of the governments have been accused of reinventing the wheel. Many of the gentlemen who are perhaps here and not here have been accused of that. Could the civil society groups, for example, be accused of reinventing the wheel if something new is not done this time? And how do we ensure that this process is new? There's some novelty in it that is different to what has been done for so many years, because there's a rich history of civil society organizations developing documents. We sort of join these collectives, sign documents, submit them. A lot has happened, and one wonders, and this is the skeptical vein that I think Professor Udagam was talking about, are we repeating ourselves? What is happening here? How do we ensure, so I think Dr. Jampati also can answer this question, because you have been involved in this process for a long time. How do we ensure that this is not yet another process? And how do we ensure that this is really a meaningful sort of effort?
An example of civil society engagement ending in leading to change is the 17th Amendment. The Constitutional Council, I think, yes, it was discussed in the 1994. Actually, Dr. Tiruchelvam, who first introduced this into our discourse. But then nothing happened because the 2000 bill did not go through. But then civil society, the civil society organizations led by the professional OPA, the Organization of Professional Associations, came out with the 17th Amendment draft, first draft. And then, well, it was lying there. But then the opportunity arose when the Chandrika Bandaranagar government found itself in a minority. And then there was pressure, and the JVP also used that opportunity and said, okay, we will support you. And this draft was taken on board. Of course, there were some changes made. So civil society, if nothing happens in the so-called political society, yes, civil society could go ahead, come out with their proposals, and there could be a time, there could be a crisis moment where you could use that.
May I add something? Actually, Albert Einstein once said that if you repeat the same test under same conditions, expecting a different result, you are insane. I don't think that you want to belong to that crazy group. So that's why I said, We are talking about public consultation. Haven't we done this before? So many times. We have repeatedly done public consultation. We have been discussing years, not months, years around the clock to reach consensus. That's why I said there are three issues. Out of these three issues, the fundamental issue is whether the nature of the state, whether unitary or federal. Unless we can find a middle ground for this issue, there will be no progress at all. You can produce the document and put in a drawer, that's all. So that's why I said you must concentrate to find a middle ground for this issue. Otherwise, you would be a group of crazy people according to Einstein.
Let me also respond. I beg to differ because Albert Einstein spoke about the circumstances under which you do this experiments. The circumstances today is completely different from the days on which we all sat in APRC, especially the post-Arakale. I know that from the younger generation, Generation Z, Gen Z. I feel, of course, is my opinion, the large majority of population today do not label themselves with a particular political opinion. So this is a great major breakthrough. And they are the future. And they will have a completely different point of view than what it was earlier. Use the digital platform, reach those generations. I don't know. Maybe they will all get together and say, give them the, even a Sinhalese in the south will say, give those Tamils and the Muslims. So they might, the Tamil and the Muslims say, we may not know it, but it's not for me or another member of parliament, or even for that matter, the government, to say, no, this is not the issue, because I don't think we have actually heard the new generations, they are thinking in the process on these three pertinent questions: presidential system, system of governance, devolution, and so on and so forth. Thank you.
I think we can't simply underestimate the role played by civil society in the constitutional making process. I would say civil society played a crucial role to take the whole constitutional making process to the grassroots. They educated the public, they mobilized the public in the whole process of constitution making. Look at the two instances, 2000 draft constitution, civil society played an important role, actually under the leadership of Professor G.L. Piris. And the Yapalani government, civil society actually made a crucial role in changing the government in 2015, and also they played equally important role in making the constitution, new constitution. Therefore, the civil society always has been an important part of constitution making process in Sri Lanka. The problem is that under some governments, the civil society has been securitized using different laws and policies, which actually prevented them from actively engaging in the constitutional making process. That's the difference. Thank you.
Guru, we'll finish with you.
On the civil society, I think the problem with the civil society, if there is one generic creature like that in Sri Lanka available, which it is not, civil society is as deeply divided as our political society, it's only natural that it is that civil society is depoliticized. The problem is that civil society space is largely occupied by, pardon me for saying this, NGOs and think tanks. And what Sri Lanka lacks is people's movements that are grassroots based, that are political in nature, right? So we have either political parties that contest elections. We don't, I mean, in Sri Lanka, we don't, except for probably one or two, have political parties that also act as social organizations. We don't. We have political parties that contest elections. Or we have civil societies that are pressure groups or think tanks. What we lack in Sri Lanka, whatever part of society that we're talking about, is politicized movements which will then bring in meaningful bottom-up political participations. Yes, mass movements. And I think that is where the organizing needs to take place. That is where the energy of the Aragalayan needs to be brought in productively into the constitutional reform process. And that seems to be the area where no one seems to work on.
Thank you very much, Guru. I think with that, I'll bring this discussion to a close. I want to thank the panelists for their very thought-provoking remarks. There's a supreme challenge here, I think, number of challenges that this process sort of faces. One is This novelty, how do you ensure that something meaningful comes out? Professor Udagamba raised this important issue of the legitimacy of public consultations. Again, that goes back to everything that you referred to, all the panelists refer to that. Is this novelty going to be a technologically driven sort of process? Is it all about AI-driven things? I mean, what's the responsibility there then about constitution making? And then finally, where do the values come in? We need to talk about the values of democracy, inclusivity, accountability, decent government. I think something that Kishal Pinuchavardhan raised in a recent column. Because there's a lot of pontification about constitutional reform, provisions and so on, but how do you ensure basic decent governance in a country? And I think these are issues that I think before one text and all of us who will be watching this particular process very eagerly. So thanks a lot. Thanks to the organizers for initiating this process, and we look forward to the deliberations.